For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Elizabeth Sams, president of Beaches Activist Movement, and we're very happy for anyone who is here or listening to this later. I think anyone attending this meeting already knows that we're going to be living with the political implications of redistricting at all levels for the next 10 years. And so many of us have been losing sleep about that already. And as we brace for the fights ahead, we really couldn't have a better consultant than Ellen Freidin, our speaker tonight. I got her bio late and I want to read some of this to you because I couldn't possibly remember it all, but she was the leader of FairDistricts Florida all the way back prior to the 2010, when her group got the 2 initiatives on the ballot to outlaw gerrymandering. Thanks to that, the Florida Constitution now prohibits drawing districts with an intent to favor a political party or incumbent. It requires that districts be compact, not wrapped all around the universe, contiguous, equal in population, and that they follow existing boundaries. And it expressly protects the rights of minority voters, all things that should make us able to sleep at night. In 2012, the legislature did an end run around all those new constitutional protections. And at that point, Ellen led 5 years of litigation to challenge the illegal maps in court and won, including 9 published opinions from the Florida Supreme Court. I'm hoping that's law that helps us this time around with the new Supreme Court. As a result of this, the illegally drawn 2012 congressional and Senate maps were held invalid, and maps submitted by Ellen's group, FairDistricts Coalition, are now the law in Florida. Those new maps, while not ideal, we can all agree, significantly leveled the political playing field in the state and added minority representatives that have been elected. So I am honored and pleased to introduce our speaker, Ellen Freidin. And to the extent you have questions, and I hope you have plenty, put them in the chat box and we'll get to those when she is done. And over to you, Carol, give it to Ellen and take it away.
Hello, everybody. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that great introduction. I agree. There is probably nothing that's going to happen in Florida this year or next, or even, continuing for the next decade, that is as important, nothing politically, I should say, that's as important as redistricting, which is coming up in the 2022 legislative session. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see if this works. Yes, there we go. And let me do oh, I can't. Let's see, slideshow. There we go.
Bravo.
How's that? Can you all see it? Good. So essentially, my life has been about redistricting for the last 15 years. My professional life, I should say. I'm a lawyer, practiced law in Miami for many, 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 many years, until about 2008, when I went redistricting full time, because I was working on developing the constitutional amendments that are now in the Florida Constitution, thanks to 63% of the voters in the state of Florida in 2010. And but it wasn't even an easy thing to decide exactly what needed to be in those redistricting, in those FairDistricts amendments. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. Certainly wasn't easy to gather the 1.5 million signatures that we needed to gather in order to get on the ballot. And then to get over 60% was an even greater task, and to raise all the money that was required to get that done, all raised contribution by contribution. There was no major big backer in this particular project. So once we had the amendments passed, as Elizabeth alluded to, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it as we go, the legislature, who had been opposing the FairDistricts amendments very, very vigorously, turned around and said, okay, we're now going to we didn't like it, but now that it's in the Constitution, we're going to have the most open, interactive, transparent, and fair redistricting process ever. Not just ever in Florida, but ever in the United States of America. That's what they said. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the story of what really happened. But first, let's talk about redistricting. You know, you hear the terms redistricting and you hear the terms reapportionment. Reapportionment is what happens after the census every 10 years when the federal government comes up with the total census numbers, and the number of representatives in Congress are divided into all 50 states. And it's done by population. And so that's reapportionment. Once the states have the number of districts that they're going to put their populations into, then they redraw the existing districts and for Congress, but they also redraw legislative districts. And the legislative districts, of course, at least in Florida, I think probably in all states, remain the same number of districts, but the lines have to be shifted based on making sure that the population of the districts is equal. So every 10 years following the US Census, state legislatures all over the country draw new districts for Congress and for state legislative representatives. But local governments also do redistricting. Your local city commissions, your school boards, your councils, and sometimes different boards or districts in your local communities get divided up into districts too. And usually it's whatever body it is that the districts serve is that's the body that actually makes the decisions about how those lines get drawn. But all of these things have one thing in common. They all depend on the US Census, and that they all have to be done every 10 years. And what's interesting is there's actually even a county in Florida, and don't ask me which one because I've totally forgotten, that hasn't redistricted in about 60 years. And it's probably a county that only has one legislative and one, is part of a legislative and a Senate and a congressional district, probably has very few county commissioners to begin with. So that's, but it's just a little interesting factoid. So while constitutionally required, doesn't mean necessarily that it gets done in every instance, but it does for sure get done by the legislature for legislative and congressional districts of every state every year. So why is this important? Well, redistricting shapes our elections for the next decade. And of course, who gets elected to represent us in Tallahassee and Washington is about as important as it gets in terms of public policy. So redistricting and the way the lines are drawn really determines which candidates have an opportunity to win. And that's just a basic fact of life. So the question is, are we going to allow the legislature, or should we allow the legislature to just draw the districts however they want? Or should we force them in some way by virtue of law? Should we make sure that they draw districts fairly? And of course, in Florida, 63% of us decided that we want our legislature to do it fairly. So redistricting determines which districts, how districts are drawn, but also which districts I vote in and you vote in, we all vote in. So it really impacts every aspect of our lives. It impacts our health, education of our children, the environment, the economy, our safety. and and how our state monies get spent. And how our federal money gets spent as well. So all of this goes on and on in terms of why it's important and how important it is. So it's a pretty natural thing, if you think about it, that if politicians are given free rein to do whatever they want regarding redistricting, they're going to draw districts that are going to favor their own party or incumbents in the legislature. So they are, our politicians and the ones who actually draw the lines for, and this is not something unique to Florida or even anything new, because gerrymandering, which is what we're talking about, started way back at the very beginning of our country. But the line drawers are motivated by a desire to stay in power and to not really have to work that hard for their power. And they do that at the expense of fair representation for citizens. So what the result of this has been in the past, that elections are predetermined, that you can tell who's going to win an election before qualifying even happens. The districts are rigged in a way to accomplish a particular political outcome. So politicians are actually, what they do is they choose voters who they think are going to be likely to vote for them. And what the result of that is that voters don't really have an opportunity to choose their representatives. They are severely limited in being able to, used to be, and probably will be after this redistricting again, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to be very limited in our choices for representatives. The other thing that happens when this kind of a practice is allowed is that there are only a very small fraction of incumbents that are ever defeated or even really challenged, because the districts are just set up in a way that the incumbent is going to continue to win until they term out, and then somebody just like that incumbent is going to take over. So there used to be no restrictions whatsoever on politicians drawing their own districts, guaranteeing victory by choosing voters that they think will vote for them. And one of the very unfortunate byproducts of that practice was it really limited the electoral clout of minorities and low-income voters. Another terrible thing that comes from it is that when districts are rigged to accomplish a particular result, representatives and even candidates don't have any motivation to follow the will of their constituents, because they know they're going to get reelected. It's all a rigged game. So they have no motivation to follow what their constituents want. And they have no motivation to work across the aisle for the common good, because usually when a large number of like-minded voters are packed into one district or another in order to make sure that the district can't be lost, then what happens is that the people who on the extremes, either the far right or the far left, depending on the district, get elected. And what happens when you have a legislature that's populated by people on the extremes? Well, you can see in Washington, frankly, what's happening with that right now, and how terrible it is. And there's no motivation whatsoever to work across the aisle for the common good. So I got kind of pulled in to head up the FairDistricts movement in 2006. And from 2006 to 2007, we drafted language, and we drafted it very carefully. In 2007, we were approved, in 2007, we were approved by the Secretary of State to start gathering signatures. And in 2009, the Supreme Court approved our language for the ballot. Now, all that meant was that we could go gather the rest of our 1.5 million signatures and then run a campaign to get these amendments passed by over 60% of the people. Well, we didn't have any citizen opposition to the FairDistricts amendments when we were campaigning for them. The only opposition came from elected political officials, both parties, by the way, more to the Republican than to the Democrat, but there were a couple of Democratic elected officials who did not like the idea of having their districts messed up because they liked the easy win and they wanted the sure thing. And they opposed FairDistricts to the tune of many millions of dollars. But we did prevail, and Floridians voted to put an end to all this political gamesmanship, at least for legislative and congressional districts. FairDistricts amendments passed, as I said, with 63% of the vote. And I want to make it clear that these amendments that are now in the Constitution only really apply to congressional districting and legislative districting. Local districts could adopt these standards, and some may have, I don't know. But the constitutional restrictions only apply to congressional and legislative redistricting. So what do these amendments, these famous amendments, say? Well, first and foremost, the legislature cannot draw districts that favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. That's the first part of the first sentence. Second part is that they can't draw districts that would interfere with or diminish the ability of minority voters, and that includes racial minorities and language minorities. So they can't draw districts with the intent or with the effect of interfering with or diminishing the ability of minority voters to elect representatives of their choice. So those are the two major principles of the FairDistricts amendments. But then you ask, well, how do you draw these maps? How do you draw the districts? And there's a second part, which called Tier 2 requirements in the amendments. And those requirements are that the districts have to be drawn as compactly as possible. They have to be contiguous, meaning the whole district has to touch. There can't be a section of it here and a section of it over there. The districts have to be as equal in population as possible on the legislative districts, but in congressional districts, the districts have to be actually equal in population. They allow a deviation of one person. So whatever number it is that the federal government says goes into a district in Florida, that's the number that all districts have to be minus or plus one. And very importantly, districts have to follow city or county lines wherever that's feasible. You know, it used to be, let's see, I mean, there are a couple of districts that you guys are in the Jacksonville area, right? Am I right about that? Yeah. I mean, the poster child for a gerrymandered district was the district that was held by Representative Corrine Brown for many years. It was designed for her, probably by her, in the 1992 redistricting. And that district started in Jacksonville, and it worked its way down into Orlando. And it picked up, I may even have a picture of it here somewhere. We'll see as we go through it, but it picked up every pocket of African-American voters that it could find along the way. in some instances, the district was no wider than a highway. I mean, it was so, this is like the poster child for a gerrymander. And it was done in the name of ensuring that there would be more than one African-American representative to Congress from the state of Florida. Certainly a laudable goal. But the way it was done, they picked up as many Democrats and as many Black voters as they possibly could. And in so doing, what do you think happens? When they do that, it makes all the surrounding districts more white and more Republican. So if you look at our list, it was not compact in any way, because it looked like a monster, actually. It was contiguous, but only because they used a highway, literally with no population for many miles, to connect two parts of it that wouldn't otherwise be connected. And it certainly didn't follow any city or county lines. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. So in 2010, the amendments passed. And after the amendments passed, the legislative leadership went public and they said, look, we know we opposed these amendments, but 63% of Floridians said they wanted them, so we're going to follow them. And we're going to have the most open, interactive, transparent, and fair redistricting process ever. Well, at the time, the very time that they were saying this, they were having meetings behind closed doors, not in the Capitol, but this is the legislative leadership meeting with Republican consultants and Republican map drawers. And they met and they came up with a scheme that probably was the biggest scam that was ever perpetrated on Florida voters. What they did is they came up with a scheme to draw maps that would favor Republicans, but that would be passed by, and that would be passed by the legislature. But they made this very big deal about wanting to have public participation in the process. And so they set up a portal where people could actually go online and draw maps and submit them to the legislature as suggested maps. But what they did was that whole portal was a big sham, because what they were using it for was they took these Republican drawn maps, they broke them up into pieces, chunks of the state, and they would submit them under names of people who were intended to look just like ordinary citizens and seem like they were being submitted by ordinary citizens. When in fact, these people didn't even know what they were submitting. They certainly hadn't drawn the maps, and they were submitting maps that had been drawn in Tallahassee or Washington in Republican Party headquarters for the purpose of ensuring Republican domination in Florida. So this was a total scam that was perpetrated in 2011 and 2012. So as the leader of the Fair Districts Coalition and the Fair Districts movement, I watched every legislative hearing and every committee meeting that there was. And it became very clear to us when the maps came out that they were very tilted towards the Republican, and that they really weren't seriously following the Fair Districts amendments, even though they continued to say that in public that they were. And this, once we saw the end result, we knew that the maps were partisan gerrymanders. It was clear to our eyes, but it took 4 years of really scorched earth litigation for us to be able to uncover the facts that allowed us to prove in court that these maps had been illegally, unconstitutionally drawn. So the court first heard the case on the congressional map. And this whole scam that I told you about was revealed in painfully ugly detail. And by the way, along the way, we requested documents from the legislators and from the legislature as a body. And they fought and they fought and they fought and they said, well, no, we're privileged. We have a legislative privilege. We don't have to turn over any of our documents. And so we went to court and we said, no, they do have to turn over. Their privilege shouldn't apply. And this Florida Supreme Court actually ruled that the legislative privilege doesn't apply to redistricting. So we went back to the trial judge and we said, look, we've got this opinion from the Florida Supreme Court. No legislative privilege, tell them to turn over their documents. And when the judge said, you've got to turn over your documents, the legislature actually admitted that they had destroyed every single document that related to redistricting other than the ones that had been made public. They had all of those, but all of their draft maps, their private communication, not private, their communications among themselves and and between them and others outside of the legislature, gone. And with impunity, they stood up and they said, well, they're all gone. We didn't think we'd have to produce them. We destroyed them. So ultimately, though, the trial court held the congressional map unconstitutional. The Supreme Court affirmed that the legislature was directed by the courts to go back and draw a new and constitutional map. The House and the Senate couldn't agree on a new congressional map. And so they came back to court and said, we don't have a map to offer. And the judge said, well, okay, so every party in the case, which included the Florida House, the Florida Senate, and the FairDistricts Coalition, and I believe in that case there was a group of Democrats who were also separately represented. So everybody submitted maps to the judge, and the judge said that he was going to choose the map that was most compliant with the FairDistricts amendments, and the map that was drawn by our FairDistricts Coalition was the congressional map that actually was put into place. The judge chose it as the most compliant. The Supreme Court agreed that it was the most compliant. And for the years 2016, 2018, and 2020, that map was the map that was in place. Of course, all of this bought the legislature and the congressional delegation 4 years on unconstitutional maps. And we sure hope we don't see anything like that again. But again, I'm very cautiously optimistic here. The Senate, though, when we were challenging the Senate map, we were getting ready for trial. I think trial was going to start maybe 2 weeks later. And we got a phone call from the leaders of the Senate saying they wanted to come talk to us. And so they came over to our lawyer's office and we sat down and they said, we want to resolve this. We want to settle this. And we said, well, there's really no way of settling this other than you admitting that your map was drawn, the Senate map was drawn contrary to the Constitution, and that it was drawn with intent to favor the Republican Party, and that it shouldn't be used anymore. And lo and behold, the Florida Senate actually went into open court and admitted that it had intentionally passed an intentionally unconstitutional map. So again, that map was in place for 2016 to 2020. But again, Florida voters had been forced to vote on a gerrymandered Senate map between 2012 and 2014. So what happened as a result? What happened in 2016? Well, we saw measurably increased competition, and that led to some better representation. The first elections under the new maps showed the beginnings of change. There were significantly more candidates running for Congress and for the Florida Senate than had ever run before. It was a big difference. And there was a big increase, even though it's not large in numbers, it's a huge increase in percentages. There was a 500% increase in Senate races that were actually decided within a 6-point margin, because before there had, in most election years, there were zero races that were decided by within 6 points. In 2014, I'm sorry, there was actually one, but that went up to 4 and then larger later on after the passage of the new FairDistricts maps. In previous cycles, there had been very, very few uncontested races, and there were many more. And there were many fewer, I'm sorry. In previous cycles, there had been many uncontested races or blowouts, which what I call a blowout, which is, you know, a race that's won by 60% or more. And that declined dramatically. But maybe as importantly, Florida in the past had seen very little competition in congressional races. But in 2016, with the new maps, we saw 5 very close congressional races, each of which resulted in a change of party for the district. Now, it wasn't all to the Democrats. It was some Republican, previously Republican areas went to Democrats, and some previously Democratic seats went to Republicans. But the important part was that voters were having a voice in who was getting elected. The districts weren't rigged anymore. There wasn't a predetermined outcome because these districts were drawn in a way that they were much more competitive. Some incumbents actually either moved to other districts or just retired because they saw the handwriting on the wall in their original districts. And other incumbents decided to run for other offices. So just to give you an example, the 2010, before FairDistricts, congressional delegation consisted of 6 Democrats and 19 Republicans. In 2016, with the new maps, first year with the new maps, it was 11 Democrats and 16 Republicans. And then in 2018, it went to 13 Democrats and 14 Republicans. So it was almost a 50-50 split, which really does kind of reflect the nature of politics in the state of Florida. In 2020, in the Trump wave of 2020 in Florida, it went back to 11 Democrats and 16 Republicans. So you can see again that the districts aren't just locked in for one party or the other. And that's a really significant thing. But even more significant is that the policy decisions and policy positions of elected officials changed after 2016. There was a Republican congressman in South Florida who had forever denied the existence of climate change, and certainly denied the impact of human behavior on climate change. And as a result of his district becoming more balanced, he changed his position. And then there was a congresswoman whose district went from lean R to lean D, who previously had opposed a federal minimum wage. And all of a sudden, she was out there touting a new minimum wage, federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. And then there was a Republican state senator in South Florida whose very safe district became a swing district for sure. And she called for a Florida minimum wage. And she was a chair of a committee that had control over gun legislation. And in the 2017 session, she had previously had a 100% rating for the NRA. But with that chairmanship and with her district having become very swingy, she blocked every NRA bill that came through the legislature that session. Big change of heart, because she knew she wasn't going to win her district if she maintained that kind of positioning. So here's what's happening now. We are about to enter the 2022 redistricting cycle officially. I will tell you that in previous years, at least a year and a half before the actual redistricting date, committees had been appointed. Legislators were being educated about how to do redistricting. They were putting out that public portal that I mentioned to you was put up many months before the actual legislative session began. This year has been a very disappointing lead up to redistricting. There has not been an announcement of a public hearing. In fact, they have said they don't think they're going to have public hearings. What they are going to do, they say, is they're thinking about or working on putting out a public portal where people can put their comments or draft maps, I suppose, although they haven't even said that, into the legislature. We don't know yet if they're really going to do that, and they certainly haven't announced a timeline, and they certainly haven't put up the portal or announced it. Now, I suspect they are going to put up something, but we have no idea what it is. We got the number of, we got apportionment numbers in April, and we learned that Florida is going from 27 seats to 28 seats in Congress. In August, the Census Bureau released its first round of actual redistricting data that can be used by the legislatures. There will be more data, or not the same data in a different format, will be released towards the end of September. But in 2 weeks, well, actually less than 2 weeks now, redistricting committee meetings will begin. Now, remember I told you that redistricting committees had been appointed a year and a half prior to the actual redistricting, because redistricting is a really complicated subject. It is not easy to understand. You have to understand the law, you have to understand all the requirements, you have to understand the math of drawing these things, you have to understand mapping. There's really a lot for a legislator who's if they're really going to be involved, to learn and to understand. So good reasons to announce committees early. Well, just this past week, the names of the committee members were finally announced. It's just it's a disgrace that they only first announced those people. But next week, I mean, on September 20th, redistricting meetings begin. So the maps have to be drawn and passed during the 2022 legislative session. So the session begins on January 11th, and it ends on March 11th. And during that time, the maps presumably are going to be drawn and passed by the legislature. I will tell you that if this year is anything like previous years, this is a very top-down process, especially this year where these committee members have only just now been appointed. These maps are probably already drawn. And these committee members are just going to do what their leaders tell them to do. They don't really have a voice in how these maps are going to get drawn. And frankly, we don't either. You know, this is something that is decided by Republicans in very high places that, and even the Republican legislators don't know exactly what's going on. They just vote the way they're told to vote. So once the maps are passed, the Attorney General has 15 days to submit the legislative maps, not the congressional map. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But submit the legislative maps to this Florida Supreme Court for what's called a facial review. And so facial challenges to the map have to be completed within 30 days after submission. The congressional map is handled a little differently. The governor actually signs the congressional maps. It's like a bill that the governor signs. And there is no facial review in the Florida Supreme Court. So any challenges that are made to that map can be made anytime after the map is signed by the governor. So all of this litigation presumably has to be finished, or should be, ideally would be finished before qualifying, which is for state and federal offices in 2022. Qualifying closes on June 17th. Then you've got the primary in August and the general election in November. And hopefully, you know, the maps are okay to go for 10 years. If not, they can always be challenged in court. So, you know, in the last legislative session, the legislature really lost the trust of Floridians. One court said that they had conspired with the consultants, with the political operatives, I call them, to make a mockery of the FairDistricts amendments. But this session so far, we haven't seen a single sign of any indication that they intend to try and earn back our trust. As I indicated, it's been a very secretive process. Committee members were just made. There haven't been provisions for public input announced. And not only that, our FairDistricts Coalition asked each legislator, actually on multiple occasions, if they would sign a pledge that would, all the pledge says is that I will follow the FairDistricts provisions of the Florida Constitution. I mean, they've already taken an oath to follow the Constitution. So all we're asking them to is to reiterate that they intend to follow the FairDistricts amendments. And out of 160 legislators, 17 have signed that pledge. And that's just that's something that really creates a situation where I don't have a lot of hope for what's going to happen this session. We've also asked them to, as a way of earning back our trust, we've asked them to engage in a number of practices that would bring transparency to the redistricting process. There is no reason in today's day and age with the technology that we have now that we didn't even have 10 years ago, that they can't live stream all mapping so that it's totally open to the public. We're not asking to be able to control the mapping, but we want to see it. And we've asked them to live stream all mapping. We have asked them to release whatever data they use. And if they live streamed the mapping, we would know what data they were using. But they have totally ignored our transparency demands, as they have ignored our call for public hearings, as they have ignored our request that everything they do is out in the open in redistricting. They actually have a rule in the House and in the Senate that says that any redistricting documents or communications are not subject to the Public Records Act. And they passed that as a statute as well. So this is a legislature that really doesn't have a real interest in bringing the public into the redistricting process or bringing the redistricting process to the public. And this is a legislature, for those of you who followed the last session, that has been notoriously non-transparent, and they've been using COVID as an excuse for not allowing people at their meetings. If you live in Miami or even Jacksonville, because it's a miserable drive to Tallahassee, you can't testify at a public hearing, at a committee meeting, or you haven't been able to, and there's no indication that you will this year be able to, unless you come to Tallahassee and testify on Zoom, but you have to be in a specific location at the Tallahassee Convention Center in order to have any communication with the legislators. So this is a totally non-transparent and non-open process completely from the legislature. So what can you guys do? I know that's what you're here for. First of all, contact your legislators, let them know that you are watching this process closely and demand that they follow their oath to comply with the FairDistricts amendments. Regardless of the pledge, they already signed an oath. They took an oath to follow the Constitution. This is in the Constitution. They've got to follow it. Let them know you're watching them. Let them know you're watching them. And tell them that you want them to follow the FairDistricts amendments. And then do what you can to spread the word about how important fairly drawn districts are to our state and the power of the people to demand fair maps and a fair redistricting process. I'm sure you work with other organizations in your area. Engage those organizations in this process too, and emphasize to everybody you can talk to the need for openness and transparency in the redistricting process. And then you can write letters to the editor, you can write op-eds for your local publications. And I don't know if you use social media, but if you do, use social media to spread the word. And then you can also, and I urge you to become involved in your municipal and county redistricting and urge those redistricting bodies to adopt the FairDistricts amendments, even though they're not legally, constitutionally bound to follow them. And with that, I would be very happy if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you very much. It's almost as depressing as I thought it would be. But I guess my first question is, assuming the process is as closed and unresponsive and uninterested in the constitutional limits as it's likely to be, what will come next in the way of challenges, and how does that work? It seems with such a compressed time frame, we have very limited opportunity to go to court.
Well, yes, there can be court challenges. There are the opportunities are limited, and the time frame. We could find ourselves in the same position that we found ourselves in the last cycle, where it took us, from 2012 when the maps were passed to 2016 when the new maps were put in place by the courts. I would hate to see that. I don't think that litigation this time around would take as long, but it might take one election cycle to get through any court challenges. But I think the courts are also, we had in the last go round, it was the first time the amendments had been applied. So it probably was more time consuming than a challenge would be this time. That said, we will be watching. And if there are grounds for challenging, I can assure you that there will be challenges brought.
And this is purely my question out of ignorance of the law. I know that our current Florida Supreme Court is a somewhat different outfit than we had the last time around. If challenges were to lose there, is there anywhere else to go, or is this a purely state limited operation? And if you lose there, you're just done?
Challenges can be brought in federal court. And you're right, it's a very different court. There are 7 members on the Florida Supreme Court. In the last cycle, we had 9 decisions from the Florida Supreme Court. You can imagine the amount of legal work that went into all of that, that litigation. But we had 9 decisions. Every one of those decisions was a 5-2 decision. The 2 who dissented, meaning they weren't on our side because we won every single one of those 9 cases. The 2 who dissented back in those years are now the 2 who are pretty much in control of Florida Supreme Court. It's the Chief Justice and one other. So of the 5, there's only 1 remaining justice of the 5 who were on the right side of history for that last election cycle. So it's not a pretty picture in the Supreme Court, but we'll be looking at it and analyzing it very carefully to make decisions about where you can go, but you can bring challenges in federal court.
Steve, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, I did. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Ellen, I have a great presentation, by the way, and I understood so much more than I ever thought I would on redistricting and the way we can possibly affect it at this point. I don't think in terms of this legislature that we're ever going to ask them to be trustful again, because we know who we're dealing with. Is Cord Bird, our local representative here, still going to be the chairman of the Florida House Redistricting Committee?
That's my understanding that he is.
So we have some, rather than think about legal action and that sort of thing down the road, we have to think about, is there a way for local groups like us to affect this process by being loud and whatever we need to be? We have a local representative here that I think that we can pounce on in terms of, asking for accountability and being upfront with the public at this point. So in terms of our timeline, that's the House, then there's the Senate, there's the Congress. What are our, rather than write letters, we know those don't go very far unless we're making phone calls and writing letters to the editor and doing those things that are publicly taken in. What is our timeline? Who can we affect as a group in this process?
Well,
does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the fact that your local representative is in a position of leadership in this process is very important. I didn't actually put it together because I don't know all these legislators, but I think that first and foremost, see if you can get a meeting with Mr. Byrd. I mean, we have tried to reach out to all these leaders. They are ignoring us completely. Maybe they won't ignore you because you're their local constituents. I don't know.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. I mean, go talk to them and tell them that the citizens of your area are going to be watching very closely to see that he follows the Fair Districts amendments. And he's probably going to say to you, oh, of course, we're going to have to. We do, but let's see what they do. And, check back with me after the first house maps are released, and we'll provide you with whatever feedback we can give you.
In connection with that, I'm assuming you guys are drawing maps already? No?
No.
There are all these tools proliferating out there. Dave's redistricting tool, districtbuilder.org, Representable. Apparently, even a 5-year-old can go online and draw a map. And we started wondering if this was something we should be trying to rally progressive groups here to be drawing maps that we could take with regard to our local Jacksonville districts, but also with regard to the state. Is there any point to that? Is anyone actually going to pay any attention to that?
Well, it's actually worse than that. It's not that there's no point to it. It's potentially damaging. And let me tell you what happened last time in the last redistricting process with people who had, well-intentioned people on the progressive side who drew maps. The legislature actually might pick that up and say, look, here's a map that was drawn by the Democratic Women's Club of wherever. And we're using part of that map. Well, what they're very good at taking pieces of maps and plugging them in to a hole and actually using them for damaging purposes. So we are not encouraging our supporters to draw maps. And for that reason, first of all, drawing a map is something that a real districting map is something that can and should be done by professionals, particularly with the FairDistricts requirements, because there's nothing easy about drawing a map that has to be compact, a district that has to be compact, that has to follow existing city, county, major geographical boundaries, that has to be as equal in population as is practicable. These are all balancing tests that need to be made while still protecting minority voters. All of this has to be factored in, and it's really complex. And you don't want your map to be the one that they use because they take a little piece of it. They won't use the whole map. They'll take a little piece of it and then they'll plug it in somewhere and make everything else around it really bad. And that's the danger. And so we have discouraged, all of our members know that we are discouraging drawing any kind of district maps. Now, local races, slightly different story. And what we would ask, and what we are asking organizations to do, is to do what's called community mapping, which community mapping is a totally different thing. That community mapping is a way of making a map of your area that shows us where certain segments of the population live. Is there a big Dominican group that happens to live in these 4 apartment buildings that are all right next to each other? Is there which is the African-American neighborhood in your community? That sort of thing. That can be very helpful. If you do things like that, you can be in touch with me, and I can put you in touch with organizations that are pulling those things together all around the state.
Okay. Do other people have questions at this point? We have a small enough crowd. I'm happy to say you can just unmute yourself and ask it if you do. I guess the last question I have while people are mulling their last chance, in the unlikely event there are public hearings, besides going to say, please follow the rules, are there other kinds of public comment that make sense for us to think in terms of preparing?
Well, the most important thing is to say follow the rules, but they're not having public hearings. They've said they're not having public hearings.
They have.
Yeah. But the message to the legislators is follow the rules, and do it transparently. We want to see what you're doing. There is just no reason in the world why the map drawing can't be live streamed.
Right.
We should be able to look at the computer screen that whoever's drawing the maps is using, and know every time there's a change made on a district line. There's just no reason in the world we can't know that. And we should also be able to have a camera in the room where the map is being drawn. And they shouldn't have the ability to do it remotely either. They should have to be in that room. You know, the maps only get drawn in that room. So if Senator so-and-so walks in and says to the person actually holding the mouse, I want my district line to jut out over here because there's my uncle lives in that house and I want to make sure my uncle can vote for me. We need to know that. You know, it's not as benign as just the uncle, I promise you.
I don't doubt it. Thank you so very much for educating us. Up, Steve, you unmute. You need to unmute here. Let me see if I can help you.
Will do. No one else seems to have a question. I'm surprised, but again, what is our timeline, Ellen? You say affect transparency, make them do these things. And that seems like something that we got to get right on. What is the timeline for each redistricting process in your, just throwing it together? Do we have, and how do we, not how do we do it? We'll have to figure that out. But.
Well, it's as soon as possible. The process, like I said, the process is they probably have already drawn the maps, but we want to put the pressure on them. And I think it's important to put the pressure on them. And let's hear, when you go to talk to Representative Byrd, I want you to take good notes and come back to me and tell me what he says. Because we can use that, we can use their responses or non-responses, and we have been using them. There have been some great editorials. I'm not sure that the Times Union has yet written one, but there have been some great editorials that have been very helpful to the cause here. So I would.
Do I look if I on video?
You're fine.
Linda?
Yeah, I had a quick question, and maybe there's some place to find this. I was wondering if we could get a list of the 17 people who did sign that they would uphold the fair redistricting.
Yes, you can. Go to FairDistrictsCoalition.org.
Okay.
FairDistrictsCoalition.org. And then you'll see the pledge. And you may have to scroll down to the bottom to click on something that says see the signers. But it should be very easy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
They're all Democrats.
Oh, I'm
what
astonished.
A surprise. Yeah, right.
Okay. Thank you for staying longer than I asked you to. Thank you for coming and sharing all this, and thank you for staying in this fight as long as you've been in it so far. And I have a little bit of business to do with people here, but you are free to leave us if you like.
Well, thank you all for inviting me and for caring so much about our state, and look forward to working with you throughout this process.
Ditto.
I am leaving now. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Ellen.
And for everybody else, thank you all for being here. I see we've had people from a number of our partner groups here, as well as BAM members, and it's a pleasure to see everybody rallied around on this. If you didn't see it today, Katie Hathaway of Mom's Demand wrote a fabulous letter to the editor that's in the Leader today. I can send that around and will when I send the next action alert. And our meeting in October, just save the date at this point. We will be staying in touch with Adele Grage and staying in touch with the news in terms of COVID to figure out whether it's Zoom or in person. But it will be a time to get busy meeting where we've got a lot of work to do, obviously redistricting, perhaps abortion rights, and vote by mail and voter registration, it's time to crank up because we don't have all that much time between us and
Save the
next
world.
year's election. And long before that, we've got this year's legislative session. So I think what Ellen had to say echoes what we were already thinking in terms of how much we need to be pushing to meet with our folks in Tallahassee, even though we know they disagree with us. They need to hear from us. So we'll be trying to organize ways to do that before the session begins. They start committee meetings now, and there'll be people are organizing various ways to either go there or try to reach out, but they're here a lot. And in many ways, it's much easier to sit down with them now before the session begins. So the other thing on our calendar for this fall is we're going to be trying to expand Bamf's membership, not because we care about being big or rich or anything else, but there's a lot of work to do. And the more people we have involved, the more work we can get done. So we're going to be doing a little ad campaign, and we're going to be reaching out to all of you to reach out to friends. I'll circulate the video of this meeting, and feel free to keep passing on our action alerts and things. The more active people we've got to throw at this, the more we can get done.
Right on.
Anybody have questions of a general nature? I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and
Thank you.
see you soon.
Thank you.